Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Hello and welcome to the Afternoon Light podcast, and today I'm joined by Sybil Nolan, and Sybil is a senior lecturer in publishing and communications at the University of Melbourne, where she also did her PhD in history, and her research areas are in publishing, print culture and Australian political and media history. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Sybil.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you on and to talk about the Menzies collection. And you are one of the few people who has sat and used it in great detail for your research. Can you tell me about the Menzies collection here at Melbourne University?
It's a fascinating collection. I first used it during my PhD, which is actually quite a long time ago now. So it probably was, maybe around 2005 or something, I first accessed it. And there was this just amazing, I asked for the catalogue, such as it was, and this grey plastic ring binder appeared with the Volkswagen icon on the front, which I've since realised is actually because there would have been, I suspect that was from when Menzies might have had some involvement with the Volkswagen Literary Awards, won by A.D. Hope and various other luminaries. But anyway, here was this strange folder with a very, approximate typed list inside of all the contents of the collection, which had more than 4,000 items in it, not only books but periodicals, photos, journals, and there was also some double-ups. There's quite a lot of duplication in the collection. But I looked through this spring binder and I had to laugh because miscellanea was by far the largest category. And I thought, whoa, this is going to be, how do I do this for my PhD? So I did use it in my PhD, but I just really dipped into it at that point, and I wanted to come back afterwards. And so in 2013, the Faculty of Arts gave me a grant to go back in and embark on a more focused project, which was on Robert Menzies' library, Robert Menzies' world. And I was starting to try and make sense of it as a world. And then it was still very challenging because it's the collection, as I think it still is, was in the Lee Scott room.
It is, yeah.
You couldn't easily, the librarians kindly showed me to the room, but then you couldn't really stay for any period of time and go around pulling books out of the locked glass cabinets for obvious reasons, that they were downstairs in the reading room, but they couldn't sit in there with you by yourself, obviously, while you did all this work. So you had to do, using the catalogue such as it was and the sort of visits to the room to look at the physical formations, and also using what by then had been created by Caitlin Stone and Jim Berryman, which was a database called
The Living Library.
The Living Library,
yes.
Sorry, yes, I knew it had an unusual name. And that, once again, it's not a full catalogue, but It does at least list books by authors and by title, and you can sort of that's a searchable database. So using all those things, I was able to start to get more of a sense of the formations of the library, if you like, and to think about how I could work with them.
It's interesting, this catalogue you talk about, which is not, as we would understand, a university library catalogue to be. It's basically a list that was typed up by his long-standing secretary, Hazel Craig, wasn't it? And it's not comprehensive either. There are items that are on the list that aren't in the collection, or vice versa. But the way the library has been arranged in the Lee Scott room is pretty much true to the way it was arranged in Sir Robert's home he lived in his retirement, in Haverbrack Avenue in Malvern, and also his post-prime ministerial office on Collins Street in Melbourne. So you can actually get a sense of how he had arranged his books, whether that's a reflection of his thinking or the categories. Obviously, as you say, miscellanea was quite the category. But you know, the categories that he thought were important to group together, which is really interesting.
And also some were from his bedroom.
Yes.
So that would be a fascinating study, to go back and look at the books that he had at his bedside, you know, presumably when he died. They would have been nearby in his bedroom. But that was a very sort of tempting way to go.
Yes.
But I was actually trying to embark on a larger project, so I put that to one side. But someone else would be a great project for a PhD student.
Yeah, what's on people's bedside tables when they die?
And he loved, you know how he loved detective fiction?
Yes. Yeah.
You know, he'd launched Joan Lindsay's book, Picnic at Hanging Rock, just shortly after he retired. You know, he was very connected to his books, and so it'd be very interesting to see what was on his bedside table.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think many of us who are readers will have bedside tables laden with books that are in the to get to at some stage to read pile. Whether you do or not is another question. Sybil, this collection, which Sir Robert gave to the university on his death in 1978, which is, you know, an amazing treasure trove of books from Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. How do you think it can best be used?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think it is a tool for researchers, but you know, I am biased, of course, because I'm an historical researcher. But I think if you look at the very interesting use that Judith Brett's made of it, if you look at the approach I've made in this chapter that we're talking about today, about Nehru's the discovery of India, you know, it definitely rewards the researcher in ways that, you know, when I go to the National Library and I read Menzies' correspondence there, it's a different sort of reward.
Yeah.
And it's complementary usually to what's going on in the actual correspondence. And for that reason, I do think that it's got a real value for researchers. I'm thinking back also to the treasures exhibitions that have been at the National Library. Just sensational, absolutely sensational exhibitions. And that there's no reason why, you know, the Macaulay, for instance, would be an interesting book to be in a treasures exhibition. I'm not suggesting that, Menzies read Macaulay as a youth and that's the copy he had in his youth or anything. It's obviously a collectible copy that I think it's in 2 volumes from memory that he had from later on. But they're still interesting books for the public to see. Also, the one that Judith Brett refers to about the book by Burke that's got the bus ticket it's got a torn out thing from a newspaper, I think, in it that shows the date that he was using as a bookmark. I myself found that really instructive when I looked at that in the library. So that sort of thing, I think you can put it on display. You know, single items could be lent out or whatever. But I think as a whole, it really needs to be kept together in one place. And I think digitisation is another option that would be great too.
And as you were saying, the collection is complementary to, for example, the papers that are held by the National Library or in the archives. So there are books with significant inscriptions from significant people in them, and you can look to the correspondence Menzies might have had with, say, JFK or Nehru, as we're going to talk about, or Winston Churchill, or, you know, political leaders in Australia, of course, Curtin Chifley, Harold Holt, and get a sort of more complete picture of that relationship. I had on the podcast earlier Martin Lyons from the University of New South Wales, who's written a book on the letters that were written to Robert Menzies from 1949 to 66. That kind of history from below is another angle, but all part of giving a more complete picture than what you would just get from reading official documents in the archives.
Yeah.
When you talk about the importance of the collection staying together,
And that was Menzies' wish too. He wanted to give this entire collection to the University of Melbourne, the university that he had studied in, that he had a real passion for. Of course, higher ed he'd had a passion for, but then of course ended his career as Chancellor of the university in the late 60s, early 70s. What does it say about Menzies, do you think, that he wanted it to be preserved in its totality? Does it give you an idea about the type of person he is? I know you write about this he has a self-image.
Yeah.
You can see in his collection.
Look, I think he really, really loved books. He knew his whole prospects were formed out of study, really. I think his family in Japan were even poorer than has been understood until recently. At that point in their lives, they were very poor.
Yes.
And the Japarat leader has glowing references to Master Robert Menzies doing well in grade 6,
Yeah.
And already the poor man is set on this long trajectory of study.
Yeah.
But he loved books. He really loved books. They helped him become what he became. They were a very important part of his identity. And, the fact he had the Lionel Lindsay bookplate in the front that showed his achievements as a barrister and as a politician, as a parliamentarian, as a leader. I think that also was an affirmation of how important the library was to him. So it's interesting. I was thinking about this morning when I was on my way in. It's interesting that Lionel Lindsay, who was a friend of his, grew up not too far from him at Creswick. Lionel Lindsay obviously didn't create that till after 1939 because it has the Declaration of War that Menzies read in it. So in starting to think about when did he was collecting books from his 20s.
Yes.
But at the start, it's a very small collection. When you look back to his childhood, there's a few books from childhood that were school prizes mainly, his adolescence, and then from the start of the 20s, his brother Frank, who he was very close to, went into the AIF and bought him some books while he was in London and sent them back. So he starts to build a collection gradually. But it's a really interesting question about when did he start to think about it as a library. And personally, I don't really have a clear answer except to say it's after 1939. And he's obviously then very cleverly worked out that often people give book collections to libraries and they're disseminated through the collection.
Yes. Yeah.
And ultimately they get, damaged by use by students and staff and other researchers, and they have to be disposed of, and then they disappear from the catalogue. So he was determined that his collection should stay together. He didn't want it disseminated through the collection. So that's a long answer, but I don't know if I've actually answered your question.
But it's interesting that he saw the utility in his collection for the university, and I think he hoped that it would be used as a reference library.
He did, yeah.
Which, given the books themselves are not rare, it's the ownership of the books and how they had been received or collected that is of interest mainly, and of course where there's annotations or insertions, inclusions, that's of interest. But yes, it's interesting that it has been, and great for us that it has been kept in the Lee Scott Room in its completeness. A key theme that you have explored in your research, Sybil, and that comes out in the collection is empire. And Menzies was quite clearly an Anglophile, looked fondly back on the British Empire, was saddened by its demise, and was never an enormous fan of the Commonwealth. I think he would have preferred the Empire to have stayed in existence, but he was definitely a big character and figure in the Commonwealth, and wanted it to be an informal meeting of Commonwealth leaders to gather together in the sort of family of nations that were part of the British Empire. How is British imperialism and the Commonwealth evoked in the collection? How do you see those themes coming out?
Yes, well, as you say, Queen Victoria was still alive. The Empire was still going strong when Menzies was born in 1894. And so he is a Victorian and he's a child of empire. The empire is so normalised, even in everyday newspaper accounts of Australian life. So in the Australian press, empire is just there all the time. His major problem with the Commonwealth later on was really started when India became a republic within the Commonwealth. He thought the whole purpose of the Commonwealth was, the relationship to the centre of empire and to the Crown and to British democracy. And so that was where his problems really began with the Commonwealth, I think.
And in some of the books in the collection, there is a sense that British imperialism was a force for liberalism, which of course Menzies was a huge proponent of, and then of course in the mid-40s went on to create the Liberal Party of Australia. How was liberalism as it was seen through the British Empire depicted in the collection? There's books where it is talked about as it being the empire as a liberating force in these colonies.
Well, I think, look, really, the best way to think about this in simple terms, I think, is to just think about British liberalism and how it's so imbricated with economic liberalism. So it's by its very nature, it's about freedom, and the freedom is economic freedom as well as political freedom. They are totally entwined. It's you can see it in its Dutch cousin to trade and the right to think what you wanted to think and speak out were all entwined together. So I think that's why in the creation of the British Empire, you keep seeing this narrative trajectory of freedom travelling with the development of empire. They go to its proponents, freedom and opportunity are seen to go hand in hand with the development of the empire. Now, obviously, if you're a person in a colonised nation, you may not actually see it the same way.
No. So, which brings us, of course, to India. And one of the real treats in the collection is a book that was given to Menzies by Indian Prime Minister Nehru in he gave it to him in 1949, was that right? Or
1950.
1950, when Menzies was visiting India, and it's Nehru's own book, The Discovery of India. There's a pleasant inscription in it to Robert Gordon Menzies with many warm regards and good wishes. Jawaharlal Nehru, New Delhi, there you go, December 27, 1950, so just after Menzies' birthday. Tell me about why this book is important in the collection and what it says about Menzies and his relations with Nehru.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth noting that early in that year, India, which had been independent since 1947, became a republic within the Commonwealth. So that had happened early in the year. So Menzies is visiting...
January 26, wasn't
it?
Yes,
yeah. Exactly. So Menzies was visiting after that event, and it was probably, in that sense, unfortunate, I think, that important visit by Menzies happened at that point. They were all on their way to the Commonwealth Conference, if I remember correctly, in Britain after that. I think the visit, if it had happened earlier, probably it would have been... more propitious. But unfortunately, we do know that we do know for a fact that it appears that Menzies did look at the book because it has a penciled date inside it, 28th of the 12th, which suggests a book historian would say, I'm not an expert book historian, but based on my understanding of book history, a book historian would say that probably means it was begun to be read on the 28th of December that year. Unfortunately, you only have to look 5 pages into the book to actually find where the uncut sections start, meaning that you can't actually open the pages because they've never been cut. So you can read the back and the front of a four-page section, but you can't read what happened in the middle. And that the part where that starts to happen is where some pretty strong criticism of the British Empire and the way the British have behaved towards the Indian National Congress, of which Nehru was leader, starts to kick in. So it's tantalising to sit there thinking about, did Menzies actually, at that stage heave the book across the room and go, I'm not going.
Is there any evidence of dents?
No, the cover's
connecting with the wall.
The cover's slightly tattered, but that's all we don't know when. That's probably just normal wear and tear because the edition was from 1946. It's a nice edition. It's actually a nice edition to handle. The paper's high quality. It was published in New York by John Day, and it had a really quite an elegant cover, and it's very nicely typeset, so it's nice to handle it. But it is in not great condition anymore. But we can tell that Menzies, he hasn't, for example, when Menzies is interested in a book and what it has to say, he'll often make just a single pencil mark in the margin. And, this is not a book. You can see that it doesn't look like he's handled it extensively. There's no useful, footy tickets in there or
bus tickets.
Yeah. So I think it's probably safe to assume that basically what he's done is that he's taken this book as this is sort of the entree card, if you like, for powerful men. They tend to send each other their books that they've written to introduce themselves. And it becomes significant within this collection, actually, what other books that are gift books like this are in the collection.
Well, Harry Truman has given his autobiography to Menzies. I think 2 copies, 2 different autobiographies he's written or memoirs. So, same type of methodology.
And that's important because it sort of tells you about the circuits, about the imperial or international circuits within which, Menzies was sort of communicating and discussing ideas. Or, in this case, it tells you actually probably there wasn't really much of a circuit going on here. Probably Nehru was an incredibly important figure by this time, and also the book is regarded as a monumental memoir, if you like.
Yes.
It's a book its reputation has lasted. It's what they call a charismatic book that actually has changed, helped change the course of history by its existence and the way it told the story. It really is Nehru's account of why India was so significant and how he, as a younger man, had made sense of the complexities of India and what he thought needed to happen to help India become a modern secular nation.
Because Nehru himself, and he and Menzies actually lead their countries for almost exactly the same period of time. Nehru dies in 64 in office, and Menzies, of course, retires in 66, and they both start in 49, I think. So it's quite extraordinary. The
47.
For
the
independence of India. But it's quite extraordinary that their periods of leadership are almost identical. And so they're experiencing the world obviously from very different perspectives. Nehru, one of the leaders and founders of the non-aligned movement, of course Menzies, absolutely key figure in the sort of US, UK, Western alliance, and of course in stark juxtaposition to the Soviet Union and its satellite states and members and, global communism. So there's, that huge tension, the Cold War tensions that are coming out from these two figures. Nehru trying to be bang in the middle. I'm not taking sides here. Menzies very much taking a side against communism. But Tell me, the Discovery of India, this book that Nehru had written, so he starts his sort of political career in 1920 or so, early 20s. And between then and becoming leader of India, it spends some extraordinary period of time in jail. The British don't take kindly to his protestations, and he's jailed various times. So he spends a lot of time, like Menzies, loves books, loves reading. I think he gets something like 20 books a month to read or something. I was reading. And he writes The Discovery of India, I think in 1944. So it's in jail.
Yeah.
So there's also a context of the times when he wrote it, his location, that I think gives the book even deeper meaning.
It does. It has a real charge. And the other thing that's worth noting, I think, is that Nehru is actually a lyrical writer.
Right.
So where you have people like Leo Amery, who was the British Colonial Secretary, who's also well known to Menzies, and sends him multiple volumes that he himself has written about the empire and what's going to happen to the empire and why India matters to the British Empire and so on. They're in the masculine language of, the white elite imperialists. And Nehru's book is quite different. It's got a lyrical turn. It's got a poetic turn in places. And he really can, construct an interesting sentence. And so he has that lovely line, which I've quoted about, where all the National Congress members are carted off to jail, and as they arrive to the fort where they're going to be, imprisoned, the moon, a crescent moon, appears in the sky. And he thinks to put that in his account, which is
interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And the way he writes about India, he writes about its people and its landscapes. That's very much part of this sprawling book.
Right.
And so it's very different to the masculinist turn of the British imperial books of the time, Jenks and Amery and the other authors who are represented in the collection at that point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And especially to reflect on the fact that Nehru himself was educated almost entirely in England. So at Harrow, he schooled at Harrow and then went on to Cambridge to study at university. So his education and I guess the foundations of his writing and reading would have been very much a British British style. But this lyricism and poeticness that's his sort of cultural roots in India. Is that what you think it's displaying?
I think you're right. You're totally right. He loved England. He really, really did. And very interestingly, Leo Amery was at Harrow, and then they were both Oxbridge types.
Yes.
So Leo Amery was 5 years before him. So Nehru is between Amery and Menzies in age, but they're not that far apart in age, really. But they've as you say, they've had Amery and Nehru have had very similar educations, and it was only later that Nehru really, the way his family was treated by the British was poor too. Members of his family were imprisoned as well, and he had a very tough time, and he felt very bitter about why had the leaders of the National Congress been jailed when actually, Nehru himself supported the British stance in the war, but he wanted India to be able to have a say in how that war was fought. He didn't want the British just to tell them what to do and to conduct this war in India. That's really why he was in prison at that time. So I think, going back to your question though, I think the thing about why there's that lyrical turn in My Discovery of India, The Discovery of India, it's actually, that's what the book is about. It's a young man's journey, and it's a journey of discovery by a young man who is actually a barrister at law, who is a member of the Inner Temple, and actually then in his own country has to confront the fact that he's going to have to take on this political role and sets off as an organiser, walking around all over the place, meeting people, getting a sense of his own country, starting to helping to organise. And so it is literally a young man's journey of discovery. And so when we wonder how it was that in, the early 40s he was able to write this book so quickly, I think because, he'd actually been thinking about this stuff for a very long time. He had very strong feelings about it.
So when he gave the book in 1950 to Menzies, and as you say, there was a bit of a tradition of these great men, and they were men, let's be honest, giving each other their memoirs. And there's probably an interesting paper on that and what it means. But it was quite a subversive book when you consider Menzies' own political beliefs, and there's quite a lot of sort of socialist ideas in Nehru's book and his policies. So, he's giving Menzies a book that he knows. I presume he's had a briefing on what Menzies stands for, and Menzies wasn't a big fan of socialism, but he's giving Menzies a book that he knows is in direct challenge to the principles that Menzies is espousing and is governing his country by. So, what can you say about that type of action?
I agree. I think I can't remember if I used the word subversive, but yeah, that was definitely how I see it. I think Nehru was a super clever guy. This had been a very, very, it's just because it all turned out fine and he got out of jail and became, Prime Minister for such a long time and such an influential world leader. We have to remember, he and his family had a hellish time for 20 years because of the British. So I think he just could, I do think it was subversive, and I think it was, in a way, it was also sly. It was slyly humorous thing to do. So while I don't personally think that I don't think the inscription is insincere, but I think it's written more in hope than in, it's written in hope rather than belief that they are going to necessarily be on the same page.
And the book remains, I appreciate it's not read beyond the first 5 pages unless Menzies got his hand on another copy.
Which is actually quite possible.
Yeah. And as you say,
sorry to interrupt, but it's not actually, there wasn't another copy in the library that I could find. I thought maybe he would have another copy of it. But actually it was a hard book to get for a long time because it was published in the US. So I don't actually think he's read another copy of it necessarily.
Interesting. Yeah. But he's kept it in the collection.
He did.
And presumably because it was given to him by Nehru, and irrespective of their differences, he would have recognised him as a significant international statesman and figure. And he's kept it till his dying day.
Yeah,
it ends up in the collection. Right. So there's I think it shows Menzies appreciated the significance of Nehru, and they met many times. They met about 12 or 15 times. Obviously at Commonwealth meetings at the United Nations, but on this particular occasion, it was of course Menzies visiting India. And in the collection, there is actually a photographs of the meeting, which is quite interesting. And you look, a photo says 1,000 words, doesn't it? So you look at their facial expressions, and are there grimaces, or it could be I'm sure you can interpret it any which way you want, but look, they seem to be pleasant in their expressions, largely in the photographs.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when you look at a lot of photographs, there'll be, the one that I used in that chapter was one that showed Nehru and other members of the Indian government or administration, and Menzies, his wife, and Heather, his daughter, who were also on the visit, and Mrs. Menzies is standing next to Nehru. Now, that's unusual, and similarly, in Commonwealth photos, often the Queen will be in the middle and Nehru will be on one side. and then there'll be other leaders, including Menzies on the other side. So I don't think it's worth over making anything particularly of, but I think it is interesting, I think, to look at those photos. I think there's also a very interesting photo in that collection of Menzies and his wife and daughter at Gandhi's grave.
Yes.
At the tomb, sorry, not the grave.
Yeah.
There's a flame, I think, from memory. So all that's there is a symbolic flame that you can see, and Menzies is looking fiercely. He looks fierce in that photo. He's looking away now. He's sort of looking away and fiercely, but then the more I study that photo, the more I realised actually he's got this burning light. It's actually the light. It's probably one of those things where the light, he doesn't have his sunglasses on, and I think the light's just pouring into his face. So, once again, you have to be really careful about
drawing conclusions
about this sort of evidence. But I must say that Indian collection of photos is a beautiful collection to look at. It's so well taken.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting historical document.
And those photograph albums in the Menzies collection, there's some of Menzies' visit to Japan, signing the commerce agreement in Japan. There's of course, the Queen's visit, the royal visit in 1954. There's a lovely album of that. There's visits to Germany, West Germany, to Malta, to Indonesia. I mean, there's Greece. There's beautiful image of Menzies at the Parthenon. So it's amazing to see, and he kept these in his personal collection, which is wonderful. I wanted to finish our discussion, Sybil, by asking you about how our views change or develop as we get older, and of course in relation to Menzies. So there are the early books. So the book by Edward Jenks that Menzies has received as a young man, and then of course you get the books later, like that he received later, like the Nehru book. Do you think these books that you get at an early age inform us of his foundational views that then develop over time? But really this was where we can see Menzies forming his small L liberal ideals in this reading at an early stage, his passion for empire and British ideals. Is that where we can pick that up, or does our thinking evolve throughout our lives and changes as we sort of read different things?
I think this is a really interesting question about Menzies' collection because the family didn't have huge amounts of money. The first books in the collection are what came to Menzies and what survived. Yeah. So, for example, there are books there that he got for school prizes very early on. Yes. And you can see they have been poured over. Yeah. And there's food stains on, there's coffee stains on, or tea stains or whatever on them. And probably the whole Menzies family read and enjoyed those books. And they're the ones that have survived that are in his collection. And so they're there because that was all there was. Yes.
And books would have been hugely expensive back then, compared to,
I think
what they are now.
For families on a budget, they were really, they had a tough time. And so I think, books were to be really valued, and they were fairly rare when you lived somewhere like Japarut, which at that point was at the end of the line. They weren't that easy to come by, although there was a newsagent or something that sold books in Japarut. We don't know very much about the books they sold. I haven't been able to discover much about that. But anyway, to go back to your question, which is really interesting, is I think Menzies' collection has a lot of evidence of backfilling. So I think when you look at things like the volumes of Macaulay, they've been bought later when he's visited Britain, and he's in middle age by that point.
Yeah. Well, his first visit to Britain wasn't until the mid-1930s.
Yeah, that's right.
So this sort of idea that he's British to his bootstraps, unlike a lot of his contemporaries in that milieu, hasn't been to Britain until he's he's 41 by that stage. So, he's developed very much as an adult by that stage without having ever been to the mother country.
Yeah, and that's one of the points I think Cameron Hazelhurst makes really nicely about how, his brothers, his two older brothers, had gone to war. They had visited London before him. They had seen the realities of war. Menzies had remained, of a romantic state of mind about Britain. And in some ways he had an arrested view of empire, I think we can say. A.W. Martin even says, Menzies on his first visit to Britain, was very romantic in his thinking about Britain, even naive. It's really interesting. So whenever he went to Britain after that, he would collect books, and what I thought I found as I looked at I found there's at least 80 books in the collection that are directly about the empire.
Yes.
And seriously about the empire. And then there's a whole lot of other books around it, say souvenirs about, Queen Elizabeth's coronation or whatever. But there's probably more than that. That's all I was able to sort of assess in that time. I was looking at the library collection. But as I became more and more aware that a lot of this book collection is actually books that Menzies bought later, because these books had a talismanic value to him.
Yes.
The Macaulay, even Virginia Woolf read Macaulay and loved Macaulay. It's one of those histories that was very, very English, and that had, was very widely read in Australia during the 19th century, and Menzies would have been really aware of it, and so obviously he wanted to have that in his collection. It's really hard when you look at that one in particular to work out whether he read it, because it had been previously owned, for example.
He might have read it, borrowing it from a mechanics institute or something, growing up. He never owned the book at the time, but read it and returned it, and then when he had the capacity to buy it himself.
Yeah, I think this is the case. I think a lot of the books that he probably used any books that were available through law libraries, parliamentary libraries. He just was, he bought books, but, once again, he really loved books, and so he would have been sourcing them from all over the place. And so I think the collection, it's very hard to say that, books from his childhood or from his early teen, it's very hard to actually say he's kept those because they were so meaningful, because actually he's kept them because they might have been super meaningful, but they were the only books coming his way.
No, it's worth reflecting on that context from which he came in Japan, very, very modest circumstances, and a lot like his political nemesis in the 50s, Doc Everett. Great reader, really defined by being brilliant at books and educational opportunities, but the circumstances from which both of them came were very, very modest. And they really had to make great use of mechanics institutes and the like around them, and public libraries in order to be able to progress. Well, Sybil, thank you so much for this discussion. It's been an absolute delight to finally meet you in person, but to have you on the Afternoon Light podcast. So thank you.
Thank you.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.